The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers gripping armrests as the aircraft bucked against invisible currents. In seat 24A, a woman in her early 40s stared out the oval window, her weathered hands steady despite the chaos around her. She wore civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer and khakis, but something in her posture suggested she'd faced far worse than a bumpy commercial flight. Flight 447 was supposed to be routine. Denver to Seattle, 238 souls aboard, clear skies ahead. The captain had just announced their descent when the first missile streaked past the starboard wing, its white contrail slicing through the afternoon sun like a predator's claw. Panic erupted in the cabin. Passengers screamed, oxygen masks deployed with mechanical precision, and the aircraft banked hard left as the pilot fought to evade whatever had just tried to kill them. Through the small window, the woman in 24A watched four sleek fighter jets emerge from cloud cover below, F-35 Lightning IIs, their angular bodies gleaming like metallic sharks. Their weapons pylons were loaded, and their targeting systems had locked onto the commercial airliner. "This is Viper Flight," crackled a voice over the emergency frequency that somehow filtered through the cabin's intercom system. "Bogey at Angels 37, civilian aircraft showing hostile intent. Weapons hot, requesting permission to engage." The woman's jaw tightened. She recognized the voice, cocky, young, probably fresh from advanced training. The kind of pilot who shot first and asked questions later. The kind who would turn 238 innocent people into debris scattered across the Colorado Rockies. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved toward the cockpit, ignoring the flight attendant's protests. The aircraft lurched again as another warning shot blazed past the port wing, close enough that passengers could feel the heat through the fuselage. The captain was on the radio now, his voice strained with desperation. "Mayday, Mayday. This is United 447. We are a civilian aircraft under attack. We have no weapons, repeat. We have no hostile intent." "Negative, 447, came the fighter pilot's response. "Our intelligence shows your aircraft was hijacked at Denver International. You are carrying enemy combatants. Comply immediately, or we will be forced to." The woman in 24A reached the cockpit door and knocked. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. The universal signal that made the captain's blood run cold. That was when everything changed. Because the woman in seat 24A wasn't just another passenger. She had a call sign that would make those F-35 pilots understand exactly what kind of mistake they were about to make. The cockpit door opened, revealing Captain Martinez, a 20-year veteran whose hands trembled as he stared at the woman before him. She stepped inside without invitation, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had flown aircraft far more complex than a Boeing 737. The first officer, Jenkins, started to protest, but something in her demeanor made him fall silent. "What's your tactical frequency?" she asked Martinez, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Ma'am, I can't let a passenger." "Your frequency, now." Martinez hesitated, then pointed to the radio selector. "Guard emergency, 121.5. She adjusted the dial with movements that spoke of muscle memory, then lifted the microphone. The fighter jets were closing formation now, their angular silhouettes visible through the cockpit windows. She could see the lead pilot in his bubble canopy, helmet turning as he tracked their aircraft. Young face, probably no more than 25. Confident, deadly, about to make the worst decision of his military career. "Viper Flight, this is Ghost 6, she transmitted, her voice cutting through the static like a blade through silk. The radio fell silent. Even the background chatter from air traffic control seemed to pause, as if the entire electromagnetic spectrum had taken a breath. In the lead F-35, Lieutenant Commander Jake Viper Morrison's hand froze over his weapon selector switch. "Ghost 6. The call sign that had become legend in fighter pilot circles, the name whispered in ready rooms from Nellies to Oceana. "Say again, aircraft calling Viper flight," Morrison transmitted, his earlier cockiness replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like uncertainty. "This is Ghost 6 aboard United 447. You have 30 seconds to explain why you're painting a civilian aircraft with fire control radar." Morrison's wingman, Captain Lisa "Falcon" Chen, pulled alongside the commercial jet and peered through her canopy. Through the cockpit windows of the Boeing, she could see a figure at the radio, a woman with graying brown hair and eyes that seemed to look right through the intervening metal and glass. Chen had heard the stories about Ghost 6. Every fighter pilot in the Air Force had. But seeing her here now, in the cockpit of a hijacked airliner, made no sense. "Ghost 6, our intelligence indicates your aircraft was compromised at Denver International," Morrison transmitted, though his voice had lost its aggressive edge. "We have orders to—" "Your intelligence is wrong, Viper," Ghost 6 replied. "This is a routine commercial flight with civilian passengers. Stand down immediately." The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 15. In that time, Morrison found himself remembering his flight instructor's stories about a pilot who had single-handedly turned the tide in 3 different conflicts. A woman who had flown missions that were still classified, against enemies who existed only in redacted after-action reports. "Ghost 6, we need verification of your identity," Morrison finally transmitted. Without hesitation, she rattled off a sequence of numbers and letters, an authentication code that made Morrison's blood run cold. Only a handful of people in the entire military had access to those codes, people who operated in shadows so deep that their names appeared in no official records, people whose very existence was a state secret. Morrison glanced at his heads-up display, where the targeting computer still held a lock on the Boeing 737. His finger hovered over the weapon release button, but suddenly the idea of firing seemed impossible. He had trained for this moment, the clean engagement, the righteous kill, the protection of American airspace from terrorist threats, but this was no longer clean or righteous. This was Ghost 6, and if the stories were even half true, he was about to make an enemy of the most dangerous pilot in the United States Air Force. "Falcon, do you copy that authentication?" Morrison asked his wingman. Chen's voice came back tight with disbelief. "Copy, Viper. Authentication confirmed. That's really her." Through the cockpit window, Ghost 6 raised her hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture that made Morrison's training kick in. It was the signal fighter pilots used when acknowledging a fellow aviator, a sign of respect between equals. But Morrison didn't feel like her equal. He felt like a child who had just pointed a loaded gun at his commanding officer. "Viper Flight, this is Control," came a new voice over the tactical frequency, their ground controller, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Webb. "What is your status? We're showing you in engagement position." Morrison keyed his mic, but found himself struggling for words. How do you explain that the most classified pilot in American military history was currently sitting in the cockpit of the aircraft you'd been ordered to shoot down? In the Boeing's cockpit, Ghost 6 watched the F-35s maintain their formation but adjust their positioning. No longer attack vectors, now they flew as escorts. She had seen this transition before, the moment when aggression transformed into respect. It never failed to remind her why she had chosen this life, despite everything it had cost her. Captain Martinez stared at her with undisguised awe. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but—" "Just someone who used to fly," she replied, settling back into the observer's seat. "Though it looks like I might need to remember how." Outside the cockpit windows, the F-35s held their position as United 447 continued its descent toward Seattle. But Morrison's radio crackled again, this time with an encrypted transmission that made his stomach drop. The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, Director of Tactical Air Command, and one of the few officers who knew Ghost 6's real identity. Viper Flight, you will maintain escort position until further notice. That aircraft is now under military protection. Any hostile action toward United 447 will be considered an act of treason. Morrison acknowledged the transmission, but his mind raced with questions. Why was Ghost 6 on a commercial flight? Why had their intelligence been so catastrophically wrong? And most importantly, what kind of threat required the most dangerous pilot in America to come out of whatever shadow she had been hiding in? The answers would come soon enough. In 14 minutes, United 447 would touch down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where a convoy of black SUVs waited on the tarmac. Ghost 6 would disappear into those vehicles, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of aviation fuel. But the real story, the reason her call sign could make hardened fighter pilots fall silent, that story was just beginning. Because somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, an enemy was preparing to test American resolve in ways that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. They had expected to face F-35s and F-22s, guided missiles and satellite surveillance. They hadn't expected to face a ghost who flew like death itself and fought like someone with nothing left to lose. The Boeing 737 descended through cloud cover, escorted by 4 of America's most advanced fighter jets. In seat 24A, an empty coffee cup sat on the tray table, the only evidence that someone extraordinary had been sitting there just minutes before. The other passengers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. None of them knew they had just met Lieutenant Colonel Eva Ghost 6 Reyes, the pilot who had saved their lives without them ever realizing they had been in danger. The woman whose call sign was whispered in ready rooms and classified briefings, whose combat record was sealed under security classifications, so high that most generals had never seen her file. But they would learn. In the coming days, as news reports struggled to explain the misunderstanding that had nearly resulted in a civilian airliner being shot down over Colorado, Eva's name would surface in fragments. Military analysts would speculate. Former pilots would share stories in hushed tones. And somewhere in the Pentagon, a folder marked with her call sign would be pulled from a vault that hadn't been opened in 3 years. The real question wasn't who Ghost 6 was. It was why she had chosen this moment to reveal herself. Because Eva Reyes had spent the last 3 years in forced retirement, grounded by injuries and political fallout from her final mission. The mission that had earned her the Medal of Honor and a discharge that felt more like exile. Now she was back, and that meant only one thing. America was facing a threat that required someone willing to cross lines that ordinary pilots wouldn't even approach. The F-35 formation peeled away as United 447 entered Seattle airspace, their pilots forever changed by the encounter. Morrison would spend the next week trying to process what had happened, replaying the moment when a routine intercept had become something that would define his career. He had looked death in the eye and found it sitting calmly in seat 24A, wearing a navy blazer and asking for the tactical frequency. In the Pentagon, Colonel Marcus Webb stood before a wall-mounted display showing the flight path of United 447. Red lines traced the aircraft's route from Denver to Seattle, with additional markers showing the positions of Viper Flight during the encounter. Webb had been Ghost 6's commanding officer during her active years, and he knew better than anyone what her reappearance meant. "She's back in play," he murmured to the empty room, his fingers drumming against the conference table. "God help us all." The secure phone on his desk rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the highest levels of government. Webb answered on the second ring, already knowing what the conversation would entail. Ghost 6 had made herself visible, which meant the invisible war was about to become very real indeed. 3,000 miles away, in a nondescript building in McLean, Virginia, intelligence analysts were frantically cross-referencing flight manifests, passenger lists, and surveillance footage from Denver International Airport. The woman who had boarded United 447 as E. Rodriguez had vanished from their screens the moment she stepped into that Boeing's cockpit. But her authentication codes had triggered alerts that reached the highest levels of American intelligence. Someone very powerful wanted Ghost 6 back in the game. The question was whether she was ready to play. Eva Reyes stood on the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, watching the black SUVs approach with practiced patience. She had known this moment would come eventually, the call back to service, the return to a world she had tried desperately to leave behind. The Boeing 737 sat behind her like a steel monument to normalcy, its passengers still disembarking with the casual ignorance of people who had no idea how close they had come to becoming casualties in a conflict they couldn't imagine. The lead SUV stopped 3 feet from her position, its tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants inside. Eva didn't need to see them to know who they were. The slight hum of electronic countermeasures, the way the vehicle sat on its suspension, even the particular pattern of tire treads, all told her that serious people had come calling. The rear door opened, revealing Colonel Marcus Webb in civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. 20 years her senior, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much classified horror, Webb had been her mentor, her commanding officer, and finally, her executioner. He was the one who had grounded her after the Caracas incident, who had signed the papers that ended her active career. "Hello, Eva," he said, stepping out of the vehicle. "We need to talk." "I figured," she replied, shouldering her small duffel bag, "though I'm curious why you couldn't just call." Webb's smile held no warmth. "Because what we need to discuss can't be transmitted over any frequency, encrypted or otherwise. Get in." Eva glanced back at the Boeing, where maintenance crews were already beginning their post-flight inspection. In a few hours, that aircraft would be cleared for its next routine flight, its brief encounter with military history reduced to a footnote in some classified after-action report. She envied the airplane its return to anonymity. The SUV's interior was more command center than passenger compartment, with multiple screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. Webb settled into the seat across from her as the convoy began moving toward an unmarked hangar on the far side of the airport. Through the bulletproof windows, Eva watched F-35s taxiing on the military side of the field, younger versions of the pilots who had almost killed her an hour ago. "You've been busy," Webb said, activating a privacy screen that rendered their conversation undetectable to outside surveillance. 3 years of retirement and you surface by talking down a fighter intercept. I'm impressed." "I was just trying to get home," Eva replied. "I didn't expect to find Viper Flight playing cowboy with a civilian aircraft." Webb leaned forward, his expression serious. "That wasn't supposed to happen. Someone fed Morrison's flight bad intelligence, told them United 447 had been hijacked by foreign operatives. The question is who and why they wanted that particular flight shot down." Eva felt the familiar chill that came with operational thinking. "You think someone knew I was aboard?" "I think someone has been watching you very carefully for the past 3 years. The question is whether they wanted you dead, or whether they wanted to force you back into play." The SUV pulled into the hangar, its massive doors sliding closed behind them with the finality of a tomb. Inside, Eva could see a familiar silhouette, a modified F-35 with non-standard markings and equipment modifications that didn't appear in any technical manual. Her breath caught as she recognized the tail number, 64285. Her bird, the aircraft she had flown into hell and somehow brought home. "You kept it," she said, more statement than question. "We kept it because we knew you'd be back," Webb replied. "The question is whether you're ready for what comes next." Eva stared at the fighter jet, memories flooding back like a tide of aviation fuel and cordite. The cockpit that had been her sanctuary and her prison. the heads-up display that had shown her targets she wished she could forget, the ejection seat that had saved her life and ended her career in the same terrifying instant. "What kind of threat are we facing?" she asked. Webb activated one of the screens, showing satellite imagery of the South China Sea. Red markers indicated hostile naval formations moving in patterns that suggested imminent conflict, the kind that requires someone willing to fly missions that don't officially exist. Eva studied the display, her tactical mind automatically calculating vectors and engagement zones. Whatever was happening in the Pacific, it was big enough to justify bringing her back from exile, big enough to risk exposing Ghost 6 to daylight operations. "Who else knows I'm here?" "Right now, you, me, and 3 people in Washington who sign budgets they never read." Webb paused. "But that won't last long. Your authentication codes triggered alerts across the intelligence community. By tomorrow, half the Pentagon will know that Ghost 6 is back in the game." Through the hangar's reinforced windows, Eva could see commercial aircraft taking off from the main runway, normal flights carrying normal people to normal destinations. She envied them their ignorance, their simple faith that the sky belonged to everyone. They had no idea that above the clouds, a different kind of war was always being fought by people whose names appeared on no monument. "What's the mission?" she asked finally. Webb smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Welcome back, Ghost 6. Let me show you why we need the dead to fly again." The briefing room occupied an entire floor of a building that didn't exist on any official map, its windows offering a perfect view of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Eva sat at a conference table that could seat 20, but today held only 3 people: herself, Webb, and a woman she didn't recognize wearing the uniform of a Navy intelligence officer. "Commander Sarah Chen," Webb said by way of introduction. "She runs the Pacific Theater Intelligence Group and has been tracking our current problem for the past 6 months." Chen was younger than Eva by perhaps a decade, with the precise movements and careful speech of someone accustomed to handling classified information that could start wars. She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the conference table with a 3-dimensional map of the Pacific Ocean. "6 months ago, we began detecting unusual naval activity in the South China Sea," Chen began, manipulating the display to highlight specific coordinates. "At first, it appeared to be routine training exercises, submarine deployments, surface vessel movements, air patrols. Nothing that violated international law or threatened shipping lanes." Red markers appeared on the hologram, showing the movement of naval assets over time. Eva studied the patterns, her experienced eye recognizing the careful choreography of military preparation. "But the patterns were too perfect," Eva observed, "too coordinated for routine training." Chen nodded approvingly. "Exactly. What we were seeing was the maritime equivalent of an orchestra tuning up before a performance, individual sections practicing their parts before the symphony begins." Webb leaned back in his chair. "Show her the satellite footage from last week." The holographic display shifted to show high-resolution imagery of what appeared to be a military installation on an artificial island. But as Eva studied the details, she realized this was no ordinary base. The runways were configured for aircraft that didn't exist in any public military inventory. The harbor facilities could accommodate vessels larger than anything currently in service. And the defensive systems surrounding the island suggested someone was preparing for a very specific kind of warfare. "We don't know what they're building," Chen continued, "but our analysis suggests it's designed to project power across the entire Pacific. If completed, it would effectively turn the South China Sea into a closed body of water." Eva stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the peaceful waters of the Sound. Somewhere beyond the horizon, an enemy was preparing for conflict on a scale that would make previous wars look like skirmishes, and they had called her back to face it. "Why me?" she asked without turning around. "You have pilots younger, faster, less complicated than Ghost 6. Webb's reflection appeared in the window beside hers. "Because this isn't a job for younger or faster pilots. This is a job for someone who understands that some missions require you to disappear completely, from radar, from satellite surveillance, from official records. Someone who can fly into places that don't exist and engage targets that were never there." Eva turned back to the holographic display, studying the artificial island with new understanding. "You want me to conduct a reconnaissance mission?" "We want you to confirm what our satellites can't see clearly," Chen replied. "The interior of that installation is shielded from orbital surveillance, but someone flying at extremely low altitude, using stealth techniques that aren't in any manual, might be able to gather the intelligence we need." The mission parameters were becoming clear. A solo penetration of heavily defended airspace, flying an aircraft that officially didn't exist, to gather intelligence about weapons that weren't supposed to be there. The kind of operation that would be disavowed if it went wrong and classified beyond recognition if it succeeded. "What's the timeline?" Eva asked. Webb consulted his secure tablet. 72 hours. After that, our analysis suggests the window for reconnaissance closes permanently. Eva understood the implication. In 3 days, whatever was being built on that artificial island would be operational. Once that happened, gathering intelligence would require an act of war rather than a covert mission. "I'll need time to familiarize myself with the aircraft modifications," she said. "It's been 3 years since I've flown anything more complex than a Cessna." Chen looked skeptical. "With respect, Colonel, this mission requires peak performance. Are you certain you're ready for operational flying?" Eva's smile was sharp as a blade. "Commander, Ghost 6 doesn't get rusty. She just gets more dangerous with time." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Eva saw Chen's expression shift from skepticism to something approaching respect. Webb nodded approvingly, recognizing the return of the pilot who had earned her legendary reputation through sheer audacity and lethal precision. "We'll have a full mission brief ready in 6 hours," Webb said. "Until then, I suggest you reacquaint yourself with your aircraft. She's been waiting for you." Eva returned to the hangar, where technicians were conducting pre-flight checks on the modified F-35. The aircraft looked exactly as she remembered, sleek, predatory, and somehow alive in the way that only the most advanced machines could achieve. But she could see the modifications Webb's team had made during her absence: enhanced stealth coatings, upgraded sensor packages, and what appeared to be experimental weapons systems that didn't match anything in the standard arsenal. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with a tablet containing the aircraft's maintenance logs. Eva had flown with Rodriguez for 2 years before Caracas, and his weathered face showed genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "Ma'am, she's been maintained to operational standards throughout your absence," he reported. "All systems green, fuel topped off, weapons systems checked and certified. She's ready to fly." Eva ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the subtle vibrations of active systems. "Any issues I should know about?" Rodriguez hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The new stealth package is experimental. Laboratory tests show it can render the aircraft effectively invisible to most detection systems, but it's never been tested in operational conditions. If it fails during your mission..." "I'll be flying naked into hostile airspace," Eva finished. "Understood." She climbed the boarding ladder and settled into the cockpit, her hands automatically finding familiar controls. The seat had been adjusted to her specifications, the instruments configured to her preferences. Someone had taken great care to ensure that everything would be exactly as she remembered. But memory was a fragile thing, especially when it came to the split-second decisions required for combat flying. Eva began the startup sequence, feeling the aircraft come alive around her as systems initialized and computers calculated flight parameters. The heads-up display flickered to life, showing a tactical overview of the surrounding airspace. "Ghost 6, this is Tower," came a voice over the comm system. "You are cleared for taxi to runway 09. Weather is clear, winds light and variable." Eva acknowledged and began rolling toward the runway, the F-35's engines providing smooth, responsive power. As she taxied past the main terminal, she could see commercial aircraft preparing for routine flights, passengers boarding, baggage being loaded, flight crews conducting their pre-flight checks. Normal people leading normal lives, unaware that their safety depended on pilots like her flying missions they would never hear about. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft responding to her inputs with the precision she remembered. As Seattle fell away beneath her, Eva felt the familiar transformation that came with returning to her natural element. On the ground, she was just another veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life. In the air, she was Ghost 6, and Ghost 6 was exactly what America needed. 2 hours later, she landed at a classified facility in Nevada, where the final mission briefing would take place. But as she shut down the engines and prepared to leave the cockpit, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. Somewhere in the South China Sea, an enemy was waiting for her. They had prepared for American satellites and conventional aircraft, for cruise missiles and naval bombardment. But they hadn't prepared for a ghost who flew by instinct and fought with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. The real war was about to begin, and Ghost 6 was finally home. The Nevada facility appeared unremarkable from the air, just another collection of hangars and runways scattered across the desert floor. But Eva knew better than to judge military installations by their surface appearance. The most dangerous places often look the most mundane, and this particular base had been the launching point for operations that had reshaped the global balance of power. She was met on the tarmac by a ground crew that moved with practiced efficiency, refueling her aircraft and conducting post-flight inspections without unnecessary conversation. These were people accustomed to serving pilots whose missions couldn't be discussed, whose very presence was classified above their security clearance. Webb was waiting in the briefing room with Chen and 2 other officers Eva didn't recognize. The holographic display now showed real-time satellite imagery of the South China Sea, with the artificial island magnified to show details that made Eva's tactical mind race with possibilities and problems. "Final intelligence update," Chen began without preamble. "The installation is now showing signs of imminent activation. Our analysis suggests they'll begin operations within 48 hours. The new officers introduced themselves as Major Lisa Park from Air Force Intelligence and Captain James Mitchell from Naval Special Operations. Both were younger than Eva, with the eager intensity of professionals who had studied her classified missions without ever meeting her in person. "Colonel Reyes," Park began, her voice carefully controlled, "we've analyzed your proposed flight path and identified several concerns. The defensive systems surrounding the target are more sophisticated than initially assessed." Eva studied the updated intelligence, noting the positions of surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, and what appeared to be energy-based defensive systems that didn't match any known technology. How sophisticated? Mitchell activated a section of the display showing intercepted communications traffic. "Our signals intelligence suggests they're using adaptive defensive algorithms, systems that learn from each engagement and modify their response patterns accordingly. Conventional stealth technology may not be sufficient." Eva nodded slowly. She had encountered adaptive defenses before, during a mission over Eastern Europe that remained classified at levels so high that even these officers probably hadn't seen the after-action reports. The key to defeating such systems wasn't technological, It was psychological. Machines learned from patterns, but humans were capable of pure, irrational unpredictability. "What about the experimental stealth package on my aircraft?" she asked. Webb leaned forward. "That's our ace in the hole. The system uses quantum manipulation to bend electromagnetic radiation around the aircraft. In theory, it should make you completely invisible to detection systems." "In theory," Eva repeated. "What about in practice?" "You'll be the first operational test," Park admitted. "Laboratory simulations show a 97% effectiveness rate, but real-world conditions introduce variables we can't fully predict." Eva had spent her career flying aircraft that existed only in theory, using weapons that worked perfectly in simulations, conducting missions based on intelligence that was often more hope than fact. The uncertainty didn't concern her. It was the natural state of warfare at the bleeding edge of technology and human capability. "Show me the target priorities," she said. Chen manipulated the holographic display to highlight specific structures within the installation. "Primary objective is the Central Command Facility, this dome-shaped building in the center of the complex. Intelligence suggests it houses the control systems for whatever weapons platform they're developing." Eva studied the target, noting its position relative to defensive systems and potential escape routes. "Secondary objectives. The power generation facility here." Mitchell indicated a series of structures on the western side of the island. "And these launch silos on the northern perimeter. If you can gather imagery of those weapons systems, it would provide crucial intelligence about their capabilities." The mission was becoming clear. Penetrate the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, photograph military installations that could reshape the balance of global power, and escape without triggering an international incident. Just another Tuesday for Ghost 6. "Extraction plan?" she asked. Webb activated a different section of the display. "You'll rendezvous with USS Virginia. She's a Virginia-class submarine currently on patrol 200 miles southeast of the target. Captain Rodriguez will be waiting at these coordinates for 30 minutes after your scheduled reconnaissance completion." Eva memorized the rendezvous point and timing. Submarine extraction was always risky, requiring precise navigation and split-second timing, but it was also one of the most secure methods of disappearing from hostile territory. "Timeline for mission execution. 1800 hours tomorrow," Chen replied. "The installation's defensive systems follow predictable patrol patterns based on our observation. There's a 17-minute window when their coverage overlaps, creating a gap in their surveillance net. 17 minutes to penetrate the most sophisticated defensive network in the Pacific, photograph 3 high-priority targets, and escape without detection." Eva had conducted missions with tighter timelines, but never against an enemy who had specifically prepared for pilots like her. "Any questions?" Webb asked. Eva stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains and across an ocean, an enemy was preparing for war. They had spent months, perhaps years, constructing defenses designed to repel any conventional attack. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed their enemy would play by conventional rules. "Just one," she said without turning around. "Are you certain this installation poses a genuine threat to American interests? Or are we conducting reconnaissance because someone in Washington is curious about Chinese engineering capabilities?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Webb's expression hardened, recognizing the implication. Eva was asking whether this mission was worth dying for, or whether she was being risked to satisfy some bureaucrat's desire for intelligence that might never be used. "Eva," Webb said quietly, "show them the Caracas footage." Chen hesitated, then activated a classified video feed that showed grainy surveillance footage of a military installation in South America. Eva watched herself on the screen, 3 years younger, flying an aircraft that had been officially scrapped, conducting a mission that had saved thousands of lives and nearly cost her everything. The video showed her final moments in the cockpit, the ejection sequence that had ended her career and begun her exile. But it also showed the explosion that had destroyed a weapons facility capable of producing chemical weapons that could have killed millions of innocent people. That installation in Caracas was a prototype, Webb said. What they're building in the South China Sea is the production model. If we don't stop it now, we'll be facing weapons that make nuclear arsenals look like conventional explosives. Eva turned back to the group, her expression unreadable. In that case, I suggest we make sure I don't miss my rendezvous with Virginia. The briefing concluded with the mechanical precision of professionals who understood that lives depended on getting every detail exactly right. Eva memorized target coordinates, defensive positions, extraction timelines, and contingency plans for 17 different scenarios. By the time she left the briefing room, she could navigate to the artificial island blindfolded and execute the mission using only backup instruments. But as she walked back to her quarters, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the intelligence picture. The enemy installation was too exposed, too vulnerable to aerial reconnaissance. Either they were incredibly arrogant, or they wanted someone to take a closer look. The possibility that she was flying into a trap didn't concern her. Ghost 6 had been walking into traps for her entire career. The key was making sure you were more dangerous than whatever was waiting for you. What concerned her was the possibility that this mission was exactly what the enemy wanted her to do. Somewhere in the South China Sea, an artificial island waited in the darkness, its defensive systems scanning empty skies for threats they had been designed to detect and destroy. But they wouldn't be scanning for a ghost who flew on instinct and fought with the fury of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. In 18 hours, they would learn why Ghost 6 had earned her reputation as the most dangerous pilot in American military history. And Eva Reyes would discover whether 3 years of exile had dulled her edge or sharpened it to a lethal point. The final test was about to begin, and failure was not an option, because the price of failure would be measured in millions of lives lost to weapons that should never have existed.